One of the questions that a lot of people are curious about when they first start planning a thru hike is how much it's going to cost them. There's a few estimates floating around online, the main ones being it'll cost about $1,000 a month, or it'll cost $1 to $2 per mile. And in general, I found these estimates to be pretty accurate for my thru hiking experiences. Based on my experience, I sit closer to $2 a mile or about $1,000 a month. When I was on trail, I wasn't keeping a strict watch on what I was spending. I just spent what felt reasonable at the time. But now that I've got off trail, I've had a look through my finances and come out with exactly how much I spent, and in general where I spent it. And so I'm going to share that information with you. In total, for just over 4.5 months on trail, I spent about $5,000 US. A big thing to take into consideration is that I spent about $1,000 on trips to New York City and DC. So my actual spend for 143 days on trail was approximately $4,000 US. I looked through my bank statements and tried to break down where all my money was spent. In some places that was really easy, like purchases on Amazon or at REI, but the place where it became a little bit fuzzy for me is accommodation and restaurants in towns. And that's because when Raiden and I were traveling together, we would split the costs of the accommodation. But to make it easier, what would happen is one person would pay for the accommodation, and then the other person would pay for food at the restaurants or something like that. And we kept a little bit of a running tally about how much we were spending, but it meant that in place to place, I could have no accommodation charges and lots of food, where he might have lots of accommodation charges and no food. So I ended up having to group those two together, just being general in-town expenses. One of the things I spent a little bit more money on than I originally thought was gear. I thought I had my gear pretty well dialed in when I started the trail, but then really soon after starting, I bought myself a brand new sleeping mat, and also, because I was having some foot troubles, bought myself a pair of socks and shoes and gaiters. Both of these things are a little bit hard to quantify as a trail expense, because the sleeping mat is obviously still in really good shape and I'll continue to use it for a long time to come. But I did spend that money while I was on trail, so I included it in my trail expenses. The same kind of went for the socks, shoes and gaiters. I ended up wearing them for about 100 miles before switching back to my sandals, and then I didn't wear them again for the rest of the trail. I used them later on the PCT and I'm using them now for running, so they're getting a lot of use, but not really Appalachian Trail use. At the same time though, I've included them because it's an expense that I had on trail. I also spent money on more clothing. I started out in a pair of shorts, but they died on me, so I ended up buying both a new skirt and then later on a pair of tights. Both of these were definitely unanticipated expenses. I had hoped that I would be able to wear my original pair of shorts the whole way through the trail. Another gear purchase that I had that set me back about $80 was a silk liner. My silk liner was pretty worn when I started the Appalachian Trail, so I knew that I'd probably have to replace it at some point during the trail. And when I did, it was great. And then there were just other miscellaneous expenses for gear. I bought a few new op sacks, a new water filter, I bought some more socks and a new bra. Another thing I spent money on in a couple of places was posting things. I had two friends in Washington State who were willing to send me things throughout the trail. So my friend Opera, I sent a box of my stuff before the trail and she posted some of that back to me. And so those were an expense that I had. And then also I had another friend post me my 2-man tent a little bit later on in the trail when Raiden and I decided to switch to that. But I ended up spending about $200 in posting things off trail as well. I'm not entirely sure where that all went. I sent a few things to my friends in Washington and then later on in the trail sent things home to Raiden's family. And I'm not sure if those expenses were just things I sent or whether they included some things that Raiden sent as well that I paid for. So it seems like a pretty big expense, like $200 on postage, but I guess it is what it is. I also had the ongoing expense of having a phone plan on trail. So when I arrived in Georgia, I got an AT&T SIM card and put that in my phone, and then just had the recurring expense of that all the way along the trail. There was plenty of times when I didn't have cell phone reception, and I kind of wondered why I was bothering to pay for a plan. But at the same time, when it was useful, it was really, really useful. And had I done the whole trail solo, I definitely would have needed it. I also ended up spending about $130 on bank fees. So the whole time I was in the US, I was still operating out of my New Zealand bank accounts. And this meant that every time I made a transaction, I was charged an offshore service margin. And I knew this going into the trail. I did the same thing when I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, but it's a bit of a bummer effectively giving away that money. There are other ways that I could have managed my money. You can buy prepaid travel cards and things like that. But at the time that I did the PCT, I decided that just going with my bank was the easiest option. And then when I did the AT, I actually didn't do any additional research. I just used the same method that I used when I did the PCT. I think if I was going to do a trail again, I would check and see if there were some better options out there, what's changed since last time I was looking. Although I now have Canadian bank accounts, and so already it's much, much easier to spend money in the US. The first big trip we did off trail was to Washington, DC. We got there on the train from Harper's Ferry, spent a couple of nights in a hotel room in town, and went sightseeing and things like that. That cost me about $350 US. And that money was spent mainly on the accommodation and the transport, because some of the tourist activities we did were free, but then also on other tourist activities and transport around the city and things like that. The second off-trail trip we did was to New York City. And New York City was the same. We caught a bus from the trail to town, spent 2 nights in an Airbnb, I think, and then went sightseeing. The thing about New York City is that the tourist activities were a lot more expensive than the tourist activities in DC, and we ended up spending about $650 in New York City. I should include that our expenses for New York City did include going to see a Broadway show, and because we bought those tickets last minute, we actually bought them on StubHub for an inflated price, but it was totally worth it to have that experience. Spending about $1,000 on effectively 4 of the days on trail seems a bit ridiculous, but as a foreign traveler visiting the east coast of the US for the first time, getting the opportunity to visit New York City and Washington, DC was definitely one I had to take. I had a fantastic time visiting those cities. Originally, I wasn't sure if I'd go or not. Probably if I'd been traveling solo, I wouldn't have bothered, but Raiden really wanted to go see the cities, and as I said, I'd never visited either of them before, and it was a great experience. I would really recommend to other people who are doing the Appalachian Trail who aren't familiar with the area that they make the time to go to those cities. It's worth noting that both of them can actually be done as a day trip if you really want to do it that way. Obviously you wouldn't be able to see as much and it would be pretty full on, but you can do it a lot cheaper than we did. We wanted to have a bit more time to see the cities, so we decided to spend a couple of nights and really get to look around. I've also had people ask if I think that being in a relationship on trail changed my spending habits. And it would seem like I should be a pretty good person to try and make this comparison, because I did the whole PCT solo, but then did the Appalachian Trail with a partner. But those 2 trails are so different, and the town stops and town setups are quite different, that I don't really feel like I can compare them. Saying that, I think that had I not been in a relationship, I probably wouldn't have spent as many nights in town or in hotels or hostel accommodation, because that's just kind of based on the way I like to do town or how I've done town in the past, where I'm much more inclined to try and get in and out in one day rather than spending the night. But saying that, had I met a group of friends and ended up doing the trail with a trail family, then I expect that I would have ended up spending nights in town with them and being sociable. With the accommodation, I guess you can also look at the fact that if I had stayed in a hostel, the cost to stay in a hostel versus 2 people splitting a hotel room is pretty similar. So I don't think there's really many positives or negatives when thinking about that. I wouldn't have been staying in any hotel rooms had I been traveling solo. I guess I can make a similar comment about food as well. Prior trail experiences, I would often get food in town at a supermarket and then just eat it or cook it or whatever and not go to a restaurant so much. But when Raiden and I were traveling, we went to restaurants for most of our meals when we were in town. And it was really nice to be able to do that. Once again, I think if I was with a family, I'd probably do more food at restaurants than if I was traveling purely solo. So I don't really know how much it would have affected my expenses. If you're trying to save money on trail, one of the easiest ways to do this is by managing your town stops. Food and accommodation in town can be a huge trail expense, and by minimizing the amount of time you spend in town, you can save on some of that money. A good way of doing this, and it's something that Raiden and I did closer to the end of the trail, is to spend your night before town, pretty close to town, maybe 3 to 5 miles before the town. And then in the morning, you can wake up, walk into town, get all of your chores done, and then get out again and camp on the other side of town. You might only end up having a 5 or 10 mile day, but you can achieve so much in town in the middle that it really makes it worth it. It also means that you don't have to pay accommodation costs, and you're likely to probably only get one meal in town at a restaurant, and then your resupply, and that's it. So you can save a lot of money on both food and accommodation. Another way that you can save money on trail, which I wasn't able to do very much on the Appalachian Trail, but it served me really well on the Pacific Crest Trail, was resupplying out of hiker boxes. Sometimes hiker boxes can be a fantastic resource when you're in town. And on the Pacific Crest Trail, I ended up doing about 3 resupplies in a row out of the hiker boxes. And this was absolutely fantastic for me. But on the Appalachian Trail, I found that the hiker boxes didn't have as much food resources in them. And I don't know if that's because there's so many town stops that people don't send as many food parcels, or maybe my timing was just really bad and every time I went to a hiker box there was nothing in it. But they're definitely something to keep in mind, and if you're on a tight budget, you can check out the hiker boxes before doing your resupply to see if there's anything you can pick up.